For nearly 2 centuries, one mansion has guarded secrets carved in stone, stories of power, tragedy, and redemption that no one was meant to hear. The story of Lyndhurst begins not with wealth, nor with power, but with imagination. In 1838, when the young American nation was still learning how to define itself in art, in architecture, and in identity, there came an architect who refused to see buildings as mere structures. His name was Alexander Jackson Davis. To him, architecture was emotion made visible, the soul of an era given shape through stone, light, and shadow. At a time when Greek Revival dominated American taste, those clean lines, white columns, and classical restraint, Davis dreamed of something far more romantic, something that spoke not of reason, but of reverence. He looked to the Gothic, to its arches that pointed heavenward, to its intricate carvings that seemed to carry whispers of faith, mystery, and longing. And in that vision, on a bluff overlooking the Hudson River in Tarrytown, New York, he found his canvas. When Davis designed Lyndhurst, he was not creating merely a home. He was composing a symphony in stone. The site itself dictated the mood-rolling lawns that fell gently to the river, ancient trees that seemed to guard the silence of the past, and the constant murmur of the Hudson flowing below. He understood that architecture must not dominate nature but harmonize with it. The mansion would rise as though it had grown from the earth itself, its turret, reaching skyward like the branches of the linden trees that surrounded it. This philosophy, borrowed from the picturesque movement sweeping through Europe, found new life in America through Davis's design. The Gothic Revival style was, in many ways, a rebellion. Where classical forms celebrated human order and rationality, Gothic Revival embraced imperfection, emotion, and the divine mystery of creation. The pointed arches of Lyndhurst's windows were not just decorative. They were aspirations cast in stone, gestures that seemed to reach towards something eternal. Davis infused every line and curve with intent. The tracery of the windows invited light to play across the rooms in patterns that changed with each passing hour, creating not static beauty, but living beauty. Every shadow was deliberate, every angle meant to evoke feeling. To walk through the halls of Lyndhurst was, and remains, to walk through a living poem. Davis's client, William Paulding, Jr., former mayor of New York City, desired a country retreat far removed from the noise and commerce of Manhattan. What he received was not a mere retreat, but an embodiment of the romantic ideal that was captivating the hearts of America's upper class. In this new world, where industry was beginning to eclipse artistry, Lyndhurst stood as an act of resistance. It was a declaration that there was still room for grace, for mystery, for the quiet contemplation of beauty. Davis gave Paulding a mansion that defied the linear logic of its age. Instead of rigid symmetry, there was movement. The structure seemed almost to breathe, each room unfolding into another with unexpected elegance, every doorway revealing yet another perspective on the river beyond. To appreciate Lyndhurst fully, one must imagine what it meant in its time. In 1838, the Hudson River Valley was becoming a haven for visionaries, artists, poets, and thinkers drawn by the sublime landscape. The Hudson River school painters were capturing its vast skies and luminous waters, finding in its wilderness a new kind of spiritual truth. Davis's architecture belonged to that same movement. His design for Lyndhurst translated that painted grandeur into physical form. The mansion's gray limestone façade, quarried from nearby Sing Sing, shimmered differently under morning and evening light, echoing the tones of the surrounding cliffs and river. It was as though the very geology of New York had been sculpted into human expression. The mansion's interior spoke the same language as its exterior. Davis's vision extended to the arrangement of space, to how light entered each room, to how every architectural element could awaken a feeling. The ceilings soared, vaulting upward like the nave of a chapel, inviting not awe for wealth, but reverence for craftsmanship. The long windows framed the world outside as if each were a living painting, trees swaying in summer wind, fog rising from the river, the golden blaze of autumn along the opposite shore. The rooms were not filled with ostentation, but with atmosphere. Even in its earliest years, visitors noted that Lyndhurst felt alive, that it carried a kind of spiritual weight rarely found in domestic architecture. Alexander Jackson Davis had always been more artist than engineer. His early training as a draftsman and his collaborations with leading landscape designers such as Andrew Jackson Downing shaped his belief that architecture must serve the senses as much as the intellect. Downing and Davis together helped to define the American version of the Gothic Revival, a style not confined to the ecclesiastical or the ancient, but one that could belong to the modern home. Their philosophy was simple: beauty and morality were intertwined. A well-designed home could elevate the spirit of those who lived within it. At Lyndhurst, that ideal was realized with an intensity that few buildings of the era could match. The mansion's composition was deliberately asymmetrical, its silhouette ever-changing from every vantage point. From one angle, it appeared fortress-like, its battlements suggesting strength and endurance. From another, it seemed delicate, almost ethereal, the tracery and pinnacles dissolving into the sky. This interplay between solidity and fragility mirrored the dual nature of the Gothic spirit, earthbound, yet yearning for heaven. The towers and turrets were not merely decorative, they created rhythm and tension, leading the eye upward and outward, compelling viewers to contemplate both the structure and the landscape beyond it. When the first rays of morning sunlight strike the mansion's limestone walls, they awaken the same emotions that Davis intended nearly 2 centuries ago. The play of light transforms stone into something almost spiritual. It is this union of the tangible and the transcendent that gives Lyndhurst its enduring power. Unlike many of its contemporaries, it does not seek to impress through size or extravagance, but through feeling. Every element of its design is a dialogue between human imagination and the natural world, a conversation still audible to those who pause and listen. In the context of American architecture, Lyndhurst stands as a pivotal work. It represents a turning point where the rigid imitation of European forms began to yield to a uniquely American romanticism. Davis was not content to copy the cathedrals and castles of England. He reinterpreted them, translating their symbolism into something that resonated with the American landscape and spirit. The Gothic at Lyndhurst was not about medieval nostalgia, it was about possibility. The belief that architecture could express the emotional complexity of modern life. Even today, the mansion retains that strange and haunting quality. The turrets cast long shadows across the lawns. The stained glass glows softly in the afternoon light, and the air inside feels thick with memory. Every curve, every carving, every stone seems to remember the hand that placed it there, the thought that conceived it, the dream that demanded it exist. Lyndhurst endures as proof that architecture can be more than shelter, more than status. It can be emotion made visible, beauty given form, a testament to the unspoken depths of the human heart that refuses to forget how to dream. When Lyndhurst first rose above the Hudson River, it was the vision of one man's longing for beauty and escape. William Paulding, Jr., the former mayor of New York City. Paulding had grown weary of the industrial pulse of the city, of its crowded streets and political noise. What he desired was solitude, a retreat where he could live not as a public figure, but as a man surrounded by quiet grandeur. When he commissioned Alexander Jackson Davis in 1838 to design what was then called Knoll, he did not yet realize that he was beginning a legacy far greater than a private residence. Paulding wanted a home that reflected his refinement, his status, and his yearning for something timeless. And Davis gave him exactly that, a Gothic Revival masterpiece, unlike anything in America. For Paulding, Lyndhurst, though it was not yet called that, was both an escape and a statement. It stood as a rebuke to the classical symmetry that dominated the era's architecture, a declaration that imagination was as noble as order. Davis's design, with its turrets and pointed arches, was a kind of architectural rebellion, and Paulding embraced it fully. Under his ownership, the estate was intimate, almost monastic, its 67 acres of land serving as a private sanctuary. He lived there surrounded by the soft hum of the river, the scent of the linden trees, and the whisper of the Hudson winds through the Gothic windows. He brought to the mansion an atmosphere of cultured repose where evenings were spent reading by lamplight and mornings greeted with the rustle of curtains drawn back to reveal the water. For Paulding, the mansion was not only a home, but a mirror of his inner self, a man torn between the demands of a public life and the desire for quiet beauty. Yet, as with all great houses, time shifted, and so did fate. When William Paulding passed away, his descendants eventually sold the estate. The land, the mansion, the dream each would fall into the hands of another, as if the house itself were destined to evolve with every soul who claimed it. In 1864, nearly 3 decades after its creation, the estate was purchased by George Merritt, a wealthy merchant whose ambition and prosperity reflected a very different America. The country had changed. Railroads and industry now defined success, and elegance was measured not in restraint, but in expansion. Merritt, a man of vision and immense energy, saw in the mansion, not a completed dream but an unfinished masterpiece waiting for his touch. When Merritt acquired the property, he found a Gothic home of modest grandeur, smaller in scale and scope than what his imagination desired. To him, the mansion's beauty was undeniable, but it needed more space, more light, more statement. He turned once again to Alexander Jackson Davis, now older and more seasoned, and asked him to reimagine his own creation. The collaboration between Merritt and Davis would transform Knoll into Lyndhurst, named after the rows of linden trees that framed the estate like nature's own colonnade. Merritt's transformation of the mansion was sweeping. The house nearly doubled in size, its wings extending outward with elegance rather than excess. Davis added the grand tower, the most striking feature of the mansion's silhouette, reaching skyward like a sentinel, watching over the Hudson. The new sections blended seamlessly with the old, a testament to Davis's genius in maintaining harmony, even amidst growth. Inside, Merritt expanded the grand parlors, raised ceilings, and filled the rooms with light filtered through ornate stained glass. The mansion began to reflect the spirit of a new age, an age of confidence, invention, and expansion. Under Merritt's ownership, Lyndhurst became a social and architectural landmark. Its interiors were adorned with imported furnishings, fine art, and the polished symbols of wealth that defined America's Gilded Age. Guests were entertained with lavish dinners, their laughter echoing beneath the vaulted ceilings. The estate's grounds, too, underwent a transformation. Merritt commissioned sweeping lawns, intricate gardens, and greenhouses that brought color to every season. What had once been a quiet country retreat now stood as a statement of success and refinement, a palace of the Hudson that reflected the golden optimism of its owner. But as often happens in history, prosperity carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. The 1870s brought financial turmoil to the nation. The Panic of 1873 struck with cruel precision, unraveling fortunes overnight. George Merritt, once among the wealthiest men of his circle, found his empire collapsing under the weight of economic despair. The mansion that had stood as his triumph now loomed as a burden. It is said that he loved Lyndhurst deeply, that even as his finances faltered, he refused to let its grounds fall to neglect. The walls that had echoed with the laughter of his guests grew silent, and the halls, once filled with light, dimmed under the shadow of misfortune. For a time, Lyndhurst became a symbol of a dream dimmed by reality, a reminder that beauty, no matter how enduring, cannot shield its creators from the world's shifting tides. Merritt's financial struggles forced him to part with the estate, and thus began another turning of the page in Lyndhurst's history. Each owner, it seemed, was drawn to the mansion by its beauty and undone, in part, by the weight of maintaining it. Yet, every transition left its mark. Paulding had given its soul, Merritt had given it scale, and those who followed would give it meaning beyond their own lives. When George Merritt departed, Lyndhurst did not simply await a buyer. It awaited another dreamer. The mansion, by now a beacon along the Hudson, had developed a reputation for its haunting charm. Its towers stood silhouetted against sunsets that painted the river gold. Travelers passing by on steamboats would gaze toward its Gothic outline and wonder about the lives unfolding within. Though ownership changed, the mansion itself remained constant, a patient witness to human ambition, love, and failure. Merritt's years left indelible imprint on the estate. His expansions had turned Davis's intimate vision into a grand Gothic narrative, one that seemed to embody the story of America itself, its rise, its reach, its risk. Even in his absence, the changes he made endured as testaments to his ambition. The tower, the wings, the gardens all bore the unmistakable signature of a man who refused to settle for beauty as he found it. He wanted to amplify it, to shape it, to make it speak louder to the world. As time passed, and new owners came and went, each left behind more than possessions. They left their essence. The architecture absorbed their presence, their joys, their fears. Paulding's refined restraint, Merritt's restless expansion, the shadows of their fortunes and failures, all of it intertwined within the mansion's bones. To walk its halls was to feel that lineage, the pulse of those who had called it home. Through these transformations, Lyndhurst evolved from a personal retreat into a living chronicle of American aspiration. Each owner inherited not only the structure, but the spirit of those before. The mansion became a reflection of the nation's shifting values, from aristocratic grace to industrial power, from private splendor to public heritage. The story of its transformation through these men was more than architectural, it was human. Every stone, every addition, every silent window carried the mark of hands that sought to leave something lasting, something that might defy time, even as its creators could not. When Jay Gould first laid eyes on Lyndhurst in 1880, the mansion had already lived several lives. It had been the romantic retreat of William Paulding, the ambitious masterpiece of George Merritt, and now it waited, silent and grand, for someone who could match its restless spirit. Gould was not a man of half measures. He was one of the most powerful and controversial figures of the Gilded Age of finance, whose name could shake the markets and stir both admiration and hatred. He had built empires out of steel, railroads, and cunning, and in the process had become one of the most reviled men in America. Newspapers called him a robber baron, a manipulator of fortunes, a man who bent the rules of commerce until they broke. Yet behind the ruthless strategist was another man, one who craved peace, beauty, and redemption. It was that man who found in Lyndhurst something he could not find in the world of iron and money, a sanctuary. When Gould purchased the estate from George Merritt's heirs, Lyndhurst stood as a relic of another time, elegant but quiet, still bearing the marks of its former grandeur. The great house overlooked the Hudson with the same solemn grace ever, but the grounds had begun to lose their vitality. To Gould, this was not just a house, it was a refuge from the chaos he had helped to create. His health was failing, his lungs weakened by tuberculosis, and he longed for a place where he could retreat from the scorn of the public eye, where his family could live untouched by the world's condemnation. In the soft light of the river and the calm expanse of the estate, he found a stillness that had eluded him all his life. He renamed little and altered less than expected, for Gould understood the power of what already existed. He did not seek to rebuild Lyndhurst into something new. He sought instead to restore and preserve it, to let it cradle his final years with dignity. Yet, even in his restraint, his presence transformed the mansion's meaning. Under his ownership, Lyndhurst became more than an architectural jewel, it became an emblem of contradiction, a place where wealth and mortality, ambition and repentance, coexisted beneath one roof. Gould devoted himself to the estate's gardens and greenhouses, cultivating a vast array of exotic plants. The mansion's conservatories became some of the finest in the country, filled with rare orchids, palms, and ferns that thrived under the glass. He found solace in tending to them, in watching life bloom quietly around him while his own strength waned. The act of nurturing something so delicate was, for him, a private act of humility, a small defiance against the decay of both body and reputation. To the world, he remained a titan of business. At Lyndhurst, he was merely a man among his flowers, a father surrounded by his children, a patient in search of peace. For his family, too, Lyndhurst became more than a home. It was a cocoon of safety, a world apart. Gould's wife, Helen Miller Gould, and their 6 children filled the estate with domestic warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold scrutiny their name received in the public sphere. Within the mansion's stone walls, laughter replaced the sound of stock tickers, and the children roamed freely across the sweeping lawns. The great Gothic rooms that once hosted elite gatherings under Merritt now rang with the ordinary sounds of family life, the echo of footsteps on marble floors, the soft murmur of piano music in the evenings, the comforting hush of a father reading by firelight. Yet outside those walls, Gould's reputation continued to cast a long shadow. His manipulation of the Erie Railroad, his clashes with Cornelius Vanderbilt, his role in the Black Friday gold scandal all had painted him as a villain in the nation's eyes. Too many, he represented the greed and corruption of an age obsessed with progress at any cost. But at Lyndhurst, away from the noise of judgment, the man who had conquered the financial world seemed to seek something that power could not buy: absolution. The estate, in its quiet majesty, became the landscape of his reckoning. There were days when Gould would walk the grounds at dawn, his figure outlined against the mist rising from the Hudson. Those who saw him said he appeared not as a conqueror, but as a contemplative spirit, his gaze lingering on the horizon as if searching for something beyond the reach of his empire. The Gothic architecture around him, with its upward-reaching spires and shadows, reflected his own paradox: a man who had spent his life climbing higher than any other, yet who now sought refuge in humility. The house itself seemed to absorb his dual nature, part fortress, part sanctuary. In his final years, as illness claimed more of him, Lyndhurst became the center of his world. Business meetings were conducted from the estate, letters and telegrams flew across the nation from his study, yet the tone of his correspondence softened. He spoke less of competition and more of legacy. Those who visited noted that his manner had changed, his voice quieter, his eyes gentler. The empire builder had become introspective. The man who once measured life in profit began to measure it in moments of peace. When Jay Gould died at Lyndhurst in 1892, at the age of 56, the nation's reaction was conflicted. Some saw his death as the fall of a tyrant. Others mourned the loss of a genius whose vision had shaped America's infrastructure. But within the walls of Lyndhurst, there was no talk of scandal or conquest. There was only silence, the kind that follows the passing of a soul who has finally found rest. His body lay in the house for a time, surrounded by the family he loved and the stillness he had sought. Outside, the Hudson rolled on, indifferent yet eternal, reflecting the mansion's gray facade and its waters. After his death, Lyndhurst passed to his daughter, Helen Miller Gould, whose heart was markedly different from her father's. Where Jay had built empires, Helen built compassion. She devoted much of her inheritance to philanthropy, funding schools, hospitals, and charitable institutions. Under her care, Lyndhurst became not just a home, but a place of healing and generosity. The same walls that had once enclosed the ambitions of one of America's most formidable capitalists now sheltered acts of mercy. In this transformation, the mansion itself seemed to complete a circle moving from power to peace, from ambition to grace. Jay Gould's legacy within Lyndhurst cannot be measured merely by the years he lived there or the fortune he left behind. His presence infused the estate with a depth it had not known before. Tension between grandeur and fragility, between the earthly and the eternal. The house, with its towers and shadows, became a reflection of the man himself, misunderstood, formidable, and strangely human. In its stonework, one can still sense his struggle, the yearning to be remembered, not only for conquest, but for something gentler, something redemptive. To this day, visitors who wander through Lyndhurst's halls can feel the imprint of Gould's spirit. It lingers in the study where he worked, in the conservatories where he found solace among the orchids, in the view from the terrace where he once stood watching the sun set over the Hudson. The mansion remains as he left it, both fortress and sanctuary, a monument, not merely to power but to the complex humanity behind it. Through Jay Gould, Lyndhurst became more than a symbol of wealth. It became a testament to the possibility of redemption, to the idea that even those who built empires from iron and ambition could seek peace in the quiet beauty of a house by the river. When Jay Gould's life came to an end in 1892, the world that revolved around him, his empire of railroads, his towering wealth, his name both feared and envied, was suddenly left to the hands of his children. Among them were his two daughters, Helen Miller Gould and Anna Gould, women of extraordinary contrast and quiet strength. Where their father had built an empire upon ambition and competition, they would build something entirely different. The estate he had turned into a private sanctuary would, through them, become a place of compassion, healing, and enduring legacy. Lyndhurst, once the fortress of a magnate, would transform into a beacon of grace. Helen Gould inherited not only her father's fortune but also the vast weight of his reputation. In an age when wealth was often flaunted and social power guarded like a crown, she chose a different path. Helen had been raised in the shadow of opulence, but she had also seen the cost of it, the isolation, the scrutiny, the moral judgment that followed her family's name. Her nature was gentle, deeply religious, and marked by a sense of duty. To her, money was not a shield but a responsibility. Lyndhurst became the center of her world, not as a symbol of privilege but as a home from which she could serve others. After her father's death, Helen poured herself into charitable work. She supported education, hospitals, libraries, and the welfare of soldiers returning from war. During the Spanish-American War, she became known across the nation for her generosity, donating hundreds of thousands of dollars to supply soldiers with food, clothing, and medical care. Newspapers that had once vilified the name Gould began to speak of her as the most generous woman in America. Yet she never sought praise. Her acts of kindness were quiet, deliberate, and deeply personal. And behind those acts stood Lyndhurst, the place where she found solace and inspiration to continue her mission. Within the estate, Helen cultivated a new kind of beauty. The grand Gothic mansion that had once echoed with the ambitions of her father became serene and purposeful. The rooms were kept not as monuments to wealth, but as spaces of comfort and grace. Guests were welcomed not as figures of influence, but as friends, scholars, and reformers who shared her ideals. The grounds, with their sweeping lawns and centuries-old linden trees, became a setting for reflection and rest. Lyndhurst, in Helen's care, lost its air of aloofness and took on something warmer, a home that breathed kindness. Her philanthropy extended far beyond the estate. She established libraries in rural towns, endowed universities, and gave generously to the YMCA and YWCA. She was one of the first major female philanthropists of her time, a pioneer who used her inheritance not for social display but for social good. Yet even as her work reached across the nation, she always returned to Lyndhurst. The house was her refuge, its quiet halls her sanctuary, after long days of managing her charitable projects. The rhythm of her life revolved around service and solitude, generosity and contemplation. The mansion itself reflected her evolving spirit. Helen oversaw restorations and subtle changes that preserved Alexander Jackson Davis's original vision while softening its grandeur. She filled the rooms with art and family heirlooms but avoided extravagance. The stained glass windows glowed in the afternoon light, the gardens flourished under her care, and the river beyond remained a constant presence, a reminder of continuity. For those who visited, Lyndhurst seemed touched by gentleness, as though the spirit of the house itself had shifted from ambition to compassion. Helen never married until later in life, when, at the age of 45, she wed Finley J. Shepherd, a quiet, dignified man who shared her values. Together they continued to use the estate for good works, hosting community gatherings, supporting local causes, and opening their doors to guests of all backgrounds. Their marriage was one of partnership and shared purpose, and the estate became a symbol of unity between privilege and service. Even after her marriage, Helen continued her philanthropic work, dedicating much of her fortune to helping others until her death in 1938. When she passed, the world mourned her not as the daughter of Jay Gould, but as one of the great humanitarians of her time. With Helen's passing, the stewardship of Lyndhurst passed to her sister, Anna Gould, whose life could not have been more different. Where Helen had stayed rooted in America, Anna had crossed the ocean to France, where she married into European aristocracy and became the Duchess of Talleyrand-Périgord. Her life was one of elegance, opulence, and public fascination. The newspapers of both continents chronicled her every move, her marriages, her titles, her social triumphs, and her heartbreaks. Yet beneath the glittering surface of nobility, Anna remained deeply tied to her American roots. The mansion by the Hudson, the place of her childhood, never left her heart. When Anna returned to the United States later in life, she found in Lyndhurst not just a memory, but a mission. The world she had known, the aristocratic courts of Europe, had changed. Wars had shattered the grandeur of the old empires, and she herself had endured scandal and loss. The quiet dignity of Lyndhurst offered her a kind of peace she had not known in decades. She chose to live out her later years there, walking the same gardens her sister had tended, resting in the same rooms where their father had once sought refuge. The mansion once again became a home of reflection and reconciliation. Anna was not content to let the estate fade into obscurity. She took on the role of preservationist, ensuring that the mansion, its furnishing, and its vast collections would be cared for with the reverence they deserved. She hosted modest gatherings, maintained the gardens, and began to consider the future of the estate beyond her own lifetime. She had no wish for Lyndhurst to fall into decay or to be consumed by private hands again. Instead, she envisioned it as something larger, as a place that could stand as a testament to history, art, and the spirit of the Gould family. When Anna passed away in 1961, she left Lyndhurst to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, making it one of the first great American estates to be protected under their care. It was her final act of generosity, her gift to the nation that had once judged her father and now revered his daughters. Through that act, she ensured that the story of Lyndhurst would not be lost to time, that its beauty and its lessons would endure for generations. The mansion that had been born of ambition, that had weathered scandal, sorrow, and triumph, would now belong to the people. The legacy of Helen and Anna Gould is written not only in the history of philanthropy and preservation, but in the very atmosphere of Lyndhurst itself. Their compassion reshaped its identity. What had once been a symbol of wealth and power became a living testament to humanity and grace. The house, with its Gothic arches and serene gardens, still carries the echo of their kindness, the way Helen's laughter once filled the halls, the way Anna's quiet footsteps lingered through the twilight corridors. Through their stewardship, Lyndhurst transcended its role as a family mansion. It became something far greater, a reflection of how wealth can be transformed into good, how history can be preserved through love rather than possession, and how even the grandest of estates can serve as a sanctuary not for the few, but for all. When Anna Gould, Duchess of Talleyrand and Perigord, passed away in 1961, she left behind more than an estate. She left behind a story, a chronicle of nearly 1.5 centuries written in stone, light, and memory. Her final act, the decision to bequeath Lyndhurst to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, was not a mere legal gesture. It was an offering, a way of ensuring that the life of the mansion, with all its echoes of triumph and sorrow, would never fade into silence. Through her gift, the house that had witnessed the dreams and downfalls of an entire lineage was reborn, not as a private sanctuary, but as a living monument to the complexity of the human spirit. When the National Trust took ownership of Lyndhurst, it inherited not only a structure of rare architectural beauty but also a tapestry of human experience woven through its every corridor. The estate stood weathered but proud, its gray limestone walls softened by time, its towers casting long shadows over the Hudson. Though the mansion's Gothic Revival elegance remained intact, the decades had left their mark. The gardens had grown wild, the once bright conservatories dulled by age, and the great halls had fallen into quiet disuse. Yet, there was something sacred in that silence, a sense that the house had merely been waiting for new guardians who would understand its heart. The National Trust approached Lyndhurst not as a relic to be frozen in time, but as a living piece of history. Their mission was not just preservation, but resurrection, to breathe life back into the house while honoring the legacy of those who had shaped it. Every repair, every careful restoration carried the weight of reverence. Craftsmen studied Davis's original designs, matching stone and wood, with painstaking precision. Conservators cleaned the stained glass windows that caught the light like jewels, revealing once again the colors that had danced across the rooms in the days of Paulding, Merritt, and Gould. The very act of preservation became a dialogue between past and present, a conversation between those who built and those who remembered. As Lyndhurst reopened its doors to the public, the mansion's transformation entered its final, and perhaps most profound phase. It ceased to be the home of a single family, and became instead the home of many, a place where visitors could walk through time, where history unfolded not in distant words but in tangible form. Each visitor who crossed the threshold added to the mansion's life, their awe and wonder becoming part of its story. The creak of footsteps on wooden floors, the murmur of admiration beneath vaulted ceilings, the soft gasp of recognition at the view of the Hudson. These became the new sounds of Lyndhurst's living pulse. What makes Lyndhurst endure is not merely its architectural grandeur, but the humanity embedded within it. The estate embodies the contradictions that define every age: ambition and humility, wealth and ruin, beauty and decay. In its earliest years, it had been the dream of a public servant longing for peace. Then it became the symbol of a merchant's triumph and fall later, the refuge of a titan seeking redemption, and finally, the sanctuary of daughters who turned inheritance into compassion. To walk through its halls today is to encounter each of those lives at once, their presence felt in every room. The mansion stands as both a stage and a witness, reflecting the arc of human aspiration and fragility. The National Trust's stewardship preserved not only architecture, but memory. The rooms were restored with their original furnishings, the artworks, and heirloom, carefully catalogued and placed once more where they had stood for generations. The gardens were revived according to historic plans, their paths winding through the same groves where Jay Gould once walked at dawn. The conservatories, filled again with orchids and palms, echoed the quiet joy that had sustained him in his final years. Yet beyond the physical restoration, the estate became something greater, a place where education, art, and history converged. Lyndhurst was no longer a silent monument. It became a voice, teaching new generations what endurance truly means. In the decades since its rebirth, Lyndhurst has become a symbol of resilience, not only for the people who shaped it, but for the nation itself. It has survived wars, depressions, and the slow erosion of time. It has stood firm while the world, beyond its gates, transformed. Its Gothic silhouette against the Hudson is no longer a symbol of wealth or exclusivity, but of continuity, the idea that history can be preserved without being embalmed, that beauty can endure even as the centuries shift around it. Each passing year adds another layer to its story, proving that endurance is not about resisting change, but about absorbing it and emerging more complete. Lyndhurst's legacy also speaks to the evolution of American identity. When it was first built, the nation was young and searching for its aesthetic voice. Davis's Gothic Revival design, so foreign to the classical ideals of its time, hinted at an emerging confidence, a willingness to blend European inspiration with American imagination. Through its successive owners, the mansion mirrored the nation's journey from agrarian modesty to industrial power, from individual ambition to collective purpose. Now, as a preserved landmark, it stands as a testament to the value of reflection, to the idea that progress and preservation are not opposites but partners in understanding who we are. The Hudson River itself, flowing steadily beside the estate, serves as a metaphor for that endurance. Generations have come and gone, empires have risen and fallen, yet the river remains constant. Its waters reflecting the same limestone facade that first caught Davis's eye in 1838. Visitors who stand at the terrace, overlooking the river, feel the same awe that Paulding felt when he commissioned the mansion, the same reverence that Gould felt when he watched the sun set through its Gothic arches. Time may have altered the world beyond, but within the bounds of Lyndhurst, the rhythm of nature and memory remains unchanged. In the twilight hours, when the sun sinks behind the palisades, the sky turns gold and violet. The mansion seems almost to breathe. The towers cast long shadows across the lawns. The stained glass glows with fading light, and for a brief moment, the boundaries between past and present dissolve. It is as though the spirits of its builders and inhabitants still walk its corridors. Paulding's contemplative gaze, Merritt's restless ambition, Gould's weary solitude, Helen's compassion, Anna's quiet resolve. Their stories are etched into the very stone, and the house, in its enduring grace, continues to tell them without words. The National Trust's guardianship ensures that this dialogue between time and eternity will not end. Through careful maintenance, guided tours, exhibitions, and educational programs, Lyndhurst continues to inspire reflection on the nature of legacy. It reminds visitors that history is not confined to textbooks or distant monuments, but lives within the spaces people create and preserve. Every visitor who passes beneath its arches participates in that living history, becoming part of the continuum that keeps the mansion alive. Lyndhurst's endurance is, in truth, the endurance of humanity itself, the refusal to let beauty perish, the instinct to remember, the desire to connect across generations. It stands on its hill above the Hudson, a silent testament to ambition transformed by time into wisdom, to loss transfigured into renewal, to the resilience that defines all who have ever dared to dream in stone.